Good evening. Good evening, friends, colleagues, gentlemen, and ladies. I welcome you to our panel this evening. The panel will be on the German elections, or better and more precisely, on the electoral campaign. But we will look into the future as well. September 26, we will see the 20th elections in the Federal Republic of Germany and the 9th election after the reunification in 1990. There are novelties around these elections. Some of these are Angela Merkel, chancellor for long 16 years, does not recandidate anymore. The race between the two biggest parties, the SPD and the Christian Democrats, is open, and it is very close. The Social Democrats are on the run, quite surprisingly for me as well, and the Christian Democrats are more in decline than most observers expected. The Greens will advance considerably, however less than the pollsters forecasted 3 months ago. The liberals will be strengthened, the left will lose voters. The AfD is supposed to repeat more or less his result in the previous elections in 2017, namely around 12% of the votes. Not only German citizens are eager to know what will happen after the elections. The political elites and the governments of the EU member states too are curious with which German government will they have to deal and negotiate during the next 4 years to come. Therefore, we do not want to look only from the inside to these elections. We also want to have views from the outside too. Having this in mind, we carefully selected the participants of our panel, and we are happy whom we got. I will very briefly introduce our panelists today. I start with Sheri Berman. She is a professor of political science at Columbia University. She does research on European history, on European politics, and the development of democracy, but also on populism and on fascism. She has written about these topics not only in scientific journals, but for a wider public as well. So, for example, for the New York Times. Bridget Lafan is Professor Emerita at the European Institute, University Institute in Florence. She was a director and professor at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies and director of the Center for Global Governance and the politics programs at the European University until her most recent retirement. She is, I should mention as well, she's a member of the Royal Academy of Ireland, better Royal Irish Academy. This is a precise name. Carsten Q. Schneider, he is sitting not, as we all expected, in Budapest. He is now in Stockholm in a hotel room, if I can be so indiscreet, Carsten. And he's a professor of political science at the Central European University. And he is very well known for methodological question in social science. So she is somehow the best known representative of QZA in Europe. And he does also research on regime change, on transition to or from democracy in different regions of the world. Last but not least, Thomas Poguntke is a professor of political science, especially comparative politics at the Heinrich Heine University of Dusseldorf. He is a director of the Institute of German and International Party Law. He does research on political parties from a comparative point of view, but also on political regimes, European integration, and German politics. So I think we have a wonderful panel which can look from the inside and the outside what is going on in politics at the elections in Germany. And I will briefly tell how we organized this panel. We will have an initial question where each of the participants has maximal 2 minutes to respond to, and then we will have a discussion among the panelists here on the screen, and at the end we will have collected some of your questions through the chat function and try to respond to these questions as well. So I start with the initial question, and this question goes as such. What is for you the most remarkable event, trend, or observation of the electoral campaign in Germany? I proposed this time that some of the insiders present the first point of view. Thomas, can I ask you about this?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I'll start with the easy answer. I think everybody is surprised by the enormous fluctuation in the polls. You already mentioned this in the introduction, that the Greens were flying really high and they looked like a very credible contender for the chancellor's office, and then they declined. The CDU was going strong, and then suddenly, almost from nowhere, the Social Democrats were climbing up. So we have enormous fluctuation in the polls. We know that our colleagues from survey research show us or tell us that there's more flexibility in the electoral market, but that is more than was to be expected. The other big surprise to me is how bad the Christian Democrats ran their campaign. They were always known for having a very professional, well-organized machinery in Berlin, and they are making many mistakes, or sort of technical mistakes, but also they don't have a real strategy. And I think this is the big surprise, and that explains why the polls are going up and down so much.
Bridget, can I ask you for a view from the outside?
Yes, indeed. So let me begin with a European perspective. And what I find remarkable is the extent to which Europe simply, and the EU and the relationship between Germany and the EU simply hasn't mattered in this election, hasn't appeared as an agenda item. And I think that's remarkable for a number of reasons. Firstly, it tells us that the anticipated Europeanization of domestic politics is very episodic and also contingent and context related. And I think as political scientists, we need to keep that in mind. And that also implies that it reinforces what I've called the EU's politics trap, that domestic politics, in the end, national elections really matter to electorates. And whereas a lot of the policies are now transnational. So there's a mismatch between the transnational policy and the national politics. And finally, I would say that we must all remember that Germany is not just electing a chancellor, but is electing a representative at the European Council, and perhaps the most important person, given the weight of Germany in the EU, that sits round that council table. So just a reminder to to Germans that this matters not just to Germany, but matters to all of us.
Quite interesting. I'm sure we will come back to this issue later on. Sheri, will you accompany us with a few from the outside, but you are a very diligent observer from the inside as well, so just choose your point of view.
So I think the two most interesting things is that what we've now seen in Germany on the center right is something that political observers and political scientists have been observing on the center left for a very long time, which is the decline of the sort of mainstream party that has anchored the party system and democracy in Germany over the post-war period, right? So the decline of the SPD is something we've been lamenting and discussing for decades. The decline of the CDU has also been going on for some time, although much less dramatically, and now we see it sort of accompanying, sort of paralleling rather the trend in the SPD. And what happens to the party system, discussions about coalitions now in Germany are almost as lively as discussions of who's actually going to win the election. The second thing is Thomas mentioned the CDU campaign. Look, 16 years of Angela Merkel. She pushed her party to the center. She did to the CDU what had happened to the SPD before, which is to say she watered down its profile. And so the fact that with her gone, the party lacked a clear profile, the party lacked a clear strategy, not entirely unpredictable. And then the last thing I will say is as parties' profiles decline, candidates become ever more important. And I think we've seen this very clearly in the German election, where the candidates receive as much, if not more, attention than the parties themselves, both for good and bad effect.
So the personalization of German politics is going on, quite interesting, and we will have to discuss whether this is a sustainable development or we come back to the classical party vote. Carsten, what is your take on this?
Before I express it, a small follow-up to Brigitte. A friend from Belgium and colleague once said that German elections are way too important to leave it in the Germans' hand to just vote. Everybody should actually vote. And it's really remarkable how little consciousness there is in Germany about this fact and this perception from outside. But so what I find the most interesting aspect is, that goes along what has been said already, the resurgence of the Social Democrats and the dramatic decline of the CDU. So while the SPD isn't back to the old days of glories of over 30, sometimes 40%, the decline has been reversed. And this is also in line with several results at the Länder level, where they have performed reasonably well. And I think this will have consequences beyond Germany on the standing and self-perception of other social democratic parties across Europe. I talk to people in Austria, and there seems to be like, look, it's not that we always have to lose elections. It seems it can be different. And we should all say, let's wait for next Sunday, but it looks as if they win more votes than we thought before. But what I wanted to say is, so I don't think that we as social scientists can ever explain when these things happen. So why exactly in this summer? But we can, because we're very bad in predicting point events. So that's in general difficult. Political scientists are bad at it, maybe not as bad as economists, but not very good. But I think in retrospect, we will find plausible accounts as to why it happened. And I would disregard things like it was the choice of the candidate, the way where they were chosen. But more what I think right now is we will, in retrospect, see that there was a general change in the political mood in the West. So I think neoliberalism with a small state and low public debt seems over. And the majority of the public seems to feel this and want that. So, so these explanations that we will come up with will have to do away with the explanations we currently have for predicting vote or election results, because all of those models, it seems, predicted with almost absolute certainty the CDU far ahead of the SPD. So the most interesting aspect is not only politically interesting, but also for political science, I think.
May I pick up something Brigitte mentioned, and Carsten quoted this important and well-known slogan, the German elections, or the election of the chancellor in Germany, is too important to leave it only in the hands of German voters. do we have an explanation why the European Union, why Europe did not play any visible role in the campaign? Thomas?
I think Europe is, or European integration is something like almost the more important German identity now. And I think if we disregard the AfD, the right-wing populists, for a moment, and to a certain degree the left party, there's a huge consensus. Every German politician knows he cannot make a mistake when he says, oh, we have to do this in Europe and with Europe and through Europe. And therefore, it's not really a matter of contention. And there are subtle differences. Some of them are actually not so subtle when it comes to the sharing of debts. But all politicians of the major or the broad mainstream parties are agreed that this is not something they really want to have debated in an election campaign, because they think pro-European integration is too important to be a matter of contention in an election campaign.
Bridget?
I agree with what Thomas says, but the outcome of the coalition bargaining that will take place will have major implications, because there are very big EU agenda items now. And so the Green Deal, 900 pieces, over 90 pieces of law. There's a major project, European collective project there, and it will depend on, I think that whoever is in power in Germany will impact on how that project is delivered or not. And then the other area, and we've had the recent the US, Australian, UK deal on the nuclear subs. I think of all of the countries in the EU, Germany is the one that has historically and traditionally tried to separate geopolitics from trade. And those days, in my view, are over, given the international system that we have and the whole area of security. Germany will have to decide over the next cycle what its contribution is to the collective security of Europe. And I think this is a very tough discussion for Germany, a tough probably issue for coalition negotiations. So I think the kind of world that suited Germany, hyper-globalization, trading state, is not the world Germany now faces. There are the China-US relationship and how that dynamic develops, the relationship between Paris and Berlin, etc., etc. In other words, the world is a less comfortable place for a Mercantilist political economy like the German one. So I think there are big decisions there that will face whatever combination of political forces governs in Germany after this election.
To take this up, Bridget, could it be a major reason why this is not a topic in the electoral campaign? Because it will become less comfortable with Germany, and which politician campaigning for election will confront the voters with a less comfortable situation?
Absolutely, but I think one of Merkel's great geniuses was to be a good crisis manager and to help Germany through the various crises since the global financial crisis. But what she didn't do, I think, was prepare Germany for this less comfortable world.
Can I jump immediately from Ireland to New York, Sheri, on this topic? Is it anyway a topic in the United States?
The topic of the outcome of the German elections?
Yeah.
Well, sure. I mean, absolutely. And as an American, of course, to hear the sort of idea that the German elections are too important to be left to Germans is, of course, you know, sort of, I don't know, funny or perhaps resonant, because, of course, one could say the same thing about American elections as well, since obviously American policy impacts people outside of American borders. As far as the EU is concerned, I mean, I would agree with my colleagues, except I would add that, you know, insofar as, you know, the two main parties or the ones who generally set the tone of electoral campaigns. Part of the thing here is that Scholz is a moderate within his own party, right? And so he is very hesitant to go for pushing Germany towards some of the measures that would actually make a practical difference in the EU. Someone mentioned the debt brake, pooling of different kinds of economic resources. And, so from Scholz's perspective, he doesn't want to push that because it's not part of his agenda. And insofar as all German parties, with the exception of the AfD, most importantly, right, accept that Europe is an important part of what Germany is, the combination of abstract acceptance of Europe combined with the fact that the mainstream party that one might expect to push more, integrative or change-oriented policies has an incentive to keep that out of the campaign. It does not surprise me, although perhaps it should sadden me, that the EU has not been, a stronger part of what's being discussed in this election campaign.
Carsten, directly to Sheri.
Well, in general, to all three. So the topic of Europe and the EU is not the only one that is sort of under dealt with in this campaign. I would say that none of the big crises or the big topics is dealt with in a serious manner. So that's a feature of the electoral campaign in general. So it's not a specific thing about the EU, unfortunately.
You would, this surprises me to some extent, Carsten, wouldn't you say that the climate crisis, global warming, it's a topic discussed again and again and again, and the Greens even were able to force the Christian Democrats and to some extent the Social Democrats as well to take a more clearer position?
Yes, but this, I think, at least my perception, if I looked at TV trials, so the discussion among the three candidates, they seem to agree on this, and there is not much discussion, it sounds to me, and given the scale of the problem, there is certainly not enough discussion. So maybe I'm a little bit too critical with it, but other social issues, inequality, or as you also in preparation of this talk mentioned, migration and so on, they are not, party positions are not clearly defined, I think, for most voters here.
It would be interesting, Thomas, you are a real inlander. Carsten is an expat somewhere in Europe. Thomas, would you share this point of view?
By and large, I would share it, yes. Obviously, there's a big debate about climate. It's not very accentuated. Everybody agrees and everybody says we have to do fast, have to do it fast, and we have to do more. And there's a little bit, there is a debate about how you should do it. But I think there are several elephants in the room. One is migration. Another one, to a certain degree, is Europe. Because if you read the programs of the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats and the Liberals, they are not agreed on pooling debts in Europe. The Christian Democrats say it was a one-off, and the Social Democrats, also Scholz, said, okay, this is the Hamilton moment of European integration, and we go further. But they avoid this because, and that is my thesis, because they want to avoid anything that brings the AfD into the debate. So they keep certain things off the agenda, and that includes also foreign policy to a certain degree. We have a debate that is completely lacking any foreign policy dimension. And this has a lot to do with this partially successful strategy of keeping the right-wing populists out of the debate.
Foreign policy was only in very rare occasion in the history of the Federal Republic a major issue. It was a major issue in 1969, the Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt, but I cannot remember when foreign policy played a real major and decisive role. And by the way, inequality, you mentioned inequality. Inequality as such was also never a prominent issue in electoral campaign. There was more about pensions, because you can win votes if you talk about pension, and sometimes very specific social policy issue. But inequality, this was more or less left to Die Linke, to the left, or do I see it wrong? Why, okay, sorry, Thomas?
If that question was in my direction, I thought you were addressing Carsten, but I'm happy to answer this. Well, there is an undercurrent of doing more for the low wage earners. And that is a real vote winner for the Social Democrats. Minimum wage, raising smaller incomes, tax breaks, etc. So we have this debate. But compared to the bigger questions that could also be debated, it is not really a very exciting debate. You know, you're absolutely right. Foreign policy is normally nothing that dominates campaigns. But you know, we had one or two. We had the Ostpolitik and we had the missile debate under Helmut Schmidt. But we were now right in the middle of the campaign. Afghanistan happened. And still, they all shy away from it. You know, again, if you read the programs, you see differences. You know, so Christian Democrats say loud and clearly, we are in favor of this NATO 2% target. The others say we won't. The left of center parties. So there would be issues to debate. But in many respects, this is a surprisingly depoliticized campaign, given the fact that we are now beginning. Or we are at the end of an era. You know, in that respect, it's a disappointing campaign, I would say.
Okay, so several of you have mentioned depoliticization and surprising decline of the Christian Democratic Union. And Sheri, you have written about the decline of mainstream party. Is it so surprising? And is it not to some extent, the way Angela Merkel governed, that the party is now in disarray?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, things, the world is complicated, but, you know, answers to questions should be relatively simple. And I think a lot of what you just pointed out is true, right? Which is Merkel is in many ways, obviously, an incredibly successful politician, most clearly evinced by the fact that she's been in power so long. But as everybody knows, right, this is not a particular insight, you know, one of the keys to her success is her ability to kind of, you know, undercut, co-opt her opponents, right? So she has done, actually, she has really hurt the SPD, or rather the SPD has really been hurt by being in a grand coalition with her as the junior partner. Many of the things, or the few things that the SPD managed to, you know, sort of push through that would have been part of its economic profile, things like, you know, whatever, parental leave or help for the underprivileged, were sort of, you know, a lot of the credit went to her. She moved her party to the center on both economic and obviously important cultural issues like immigration. And so she has remained incredibly popular, I think, as a person who sort of personifies a rational, technocratic view of politics in a time of populism and irrationality. But by watering down the profile of her party, right, with her being gone, you know, you have voters, as was pointed out at the beginning, who are much more mobile, much more volatile, much less committed to the party than they might have been 16 years ago, simply because it's not as clear what that party stands for. And again, in these kinds of elections where party profiles are less distinct, where party identities are less clear, personalities make a difference. And again, hence the discussion more of, you know, Scholz is Merkel's real, you know, sort of inheritor, you know, the mistakes made by Laschet and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think that while she was successful in many ways, what she has done has created problems for her party post her.
Anyway, you can respond whenever you want. If somebody of your colleagues says something extremely intelligent or extremely wrong, so just intervene and come into the discussion. You don't need my concession. But if I can pass the question, Bridget, to you as well, from an Irish perspective, which we lack very often in Germany, any knowledge. Isn't it the case in Ireland as well that catch-all party are an dinosaur of the past, or do you still have examples where they survive?
So in Ireland, the two main parties, which were centre-right parties, because the political continuum in Ireland is extremely narrow, they have, their vote share has declined in every election since. So this is a broader phenomenon where centrist parties are being squeezed from both sides, and the challenger parties are evident. But what we don't have in Ireland is a viable right wing. None. There simply is not a right-wing populist party in Ireland. And that's a remarkable thing. There never has been in the history of the Irish state. Now, the challenger party in Ireland, which in fact will become the party of government after the next election, is Sinn Féin, which is a left-wing party. So that points again to the rise of the left. But I think perhaps in Germany, what we're seeing is both the fragmentation and the volatility that were seen in other European countries earlier. That in one sense, Germany is catching up, I think.
This is an interesting point, catching up. So you mean this is a kind of European normalization of the German party system? So Bridget disappeared for the moment out of technical problems. Then Carsten jumps in and responds to this difficult question.
No, reflecting also, I think Sheri is absolutely right that while there is a general trend to fragmentation and decline of catch-all parties, there are some German-specific factors, and Merkel plays a big role. And now I think almost paradoxically or ironically, this fragmentation, if it doesn't last forever, and Germany can maybe heal German politics from a Merkelism. So for this depoliticization, grand coalitions internally. So it could be more fun now to be in politics. There is more possibilities, and people could get more excited than they unfortunately, it seems, have been getting in these election campaigns. But in the next couple of years, we can see more movement that can be healthy, as long as, and this is one of the worries I have, is that as long as the CDU is not moving further to the right, maybe in response to an electoral defeat that is just too big to be ignored. So what will they do if they really ended up with 20%? And if they keep the cordon sanitaire around the AfD? So that would be a bad outcome of fragmentation, but all the rest, I would say, can be, injecting blood into German democracy.
Would you then argue they would not openly change their programmatic outlook, but they would, let's say, start to form coalition with the AfD on a municipal level and on a Länder level, or they would programmatically move to the right as a response to a potential or a quite obvious defeat?
Maybe in steps, all of these can happen, but it's mostly in the beginning about signaling. So what do they allow that can be said and can be done within their own ranks? If they really form coalitions at the Länder level with the AfD, I think this is still not something we can expect in the next years. But at the local level, I wouldn't be so sure, but I saw Thomas shaking his head.
Sheri?
Sorry, now I can be heard.
Thomas, sorry.
No, I agree. I was shaking my head because I don't really think it's realistically on the cards that we will see CDU AfD coalitions. Not so much because of the positions, but the AfD has moved into the unrespectable corner. That was not the case right from the beginning. We must not forget this, but I think this debate for the time being is over. The other thing is, of course, you're absolutely right. If the CDU really gets a bad result, which I think the race is still open. I'm not sure where I would put my money, but then there will be a lot of infighting. You know, there was too much has happened in the process of how to select the chancellor candidate, and the CDU had two leaders over a short period of time. And that's probably, I mean, you're absolutely right what you said earlier. You know, we have long-term trends and then we have events. And one of the events, or one of the crucial junctures, was the inability of the chancellor to somehow organize her succession. Obviously,
but we are living in a democracy. Why should a chancellor organize her succession?
This is absolutely a legitimate question, but what I mean is that she should have considered to resign from both offices earlier to give a new incumbent a head start. But that obviously conflicted with her ambition to serve as long as Helmut Kohl did. And now the Christian Democrats are probably paying a price here. The other point I wanted to make, and that's I very much agree with what Sheri said, that personalities are important. And in Germany, we have this test laboratory to look at land elections, where we see very contradictory results. And the rule of thumb is, if there's a strong prime minister, never mind which party, he will sort of push all the other parties aside. We will see this again also next week in Mecklenburg-West Pomerania. We've seen it in Baden-Württemberg, we've seen it in Rhineland-Palatinate and so on. So this is a very strong tendency that personalities matter a lot.
Is this another Europeanization of the German party system? This kind of personalization that we were used to say in the past, 60%, around 60% of our party vote is a party preference and not a personal preference. And now we are somehow unclear. We think it plays a much bigger role, but it's quite interesting to see that we do not have one single charismatic personality among the three candidates. Who would have thought that the very able technocrat, Olaf Scholz, with an international reputation, but certainly not a charismatic politician, then becomes so many preferential votes among the German voters. Nobody would have thought about it. And the other twos are not charismatic as well, and even not technocratic. So weak candidates and personalization of German politics, is it not a kind of paradox? This might be a question for Sheri. She knows quite a lot about German parties.
Well, again, I would go back to the sort of the basic trade-off, right? The stronger the party is, the stronger its profile, the more voters identify with it, the less important the candidate is, right? So insofar as we now have two mainstream parties whose profiles and identities have been watered down, the focus is much more on, again, Scholz is competent, he has a national reputation, Laschet has made some, missteps, blah, blah, blah. I think that rather than seeing the candidates as the sort of independent variable, they're really not, right? It's really the parties' declining profiles and identities that have made them a more significant factor. I'd like to go back to this question, though, of the CDU and the AfD, because I think that this is another place where Germany actually overlaps with trends in Europe more generally, and where we're talking about some very important things for the future. So, as my colleagues have pointed out, we have seen the same dilemma in other countries, right? As the center-right party is no longer able to form majority coalitions with just, let's say, one other party, right? It faces a problem, because when the right populists have become big enough to block any other kind of viable coalition, a fight is going to break out within that party about what to do about that. The best contemporary example of that actually is Sweden, where, as in Germany, the sort of conservative party moved very, very much to the center on immigration and national identity issues. There was an agreement across the political spectrum. We are never going to talk to the Sweden Democrats. They are right-wing populist kooks. We are going to exclude them. And that did absolutely nothing to stop their rise. They are now, up at around 20%, despite the fact that Swedes are not particularly racist or xenophobic. And what have we seen over the last several years? We have seen the major conservative party, as well as the smaller Christian Democratic Party, now say, well, you know, we should talk to the Sweden Democrats. They have 20% of the vote. It's a democracy, blah, blah, blah. But the other thing that has happened, and this is what Tomas pointed out, is that at the same time as it became clear that a right-wing government couldn't be formed without the right-wing populists, the Sweden Democrats moderated to the point where, again, to use Tomas's phrase, they are now respectable. What's stopping the AfD from doing that in Germany? Well, it seems to me that the federal system here is very important. The AfD in Germany is a heavily East party. It can win elections at the Länder level in the East with what I think for the rest of us would be somewhat kooky, irresponsible candidates. If that should change, if the party should somehow decide to move to the respectable, you know, sort of part of respectable, part of the spectrum, as its sort of counterpart in Austria did, as its counterpart in France did, as its counterpart in Sweden did, absolutely, this is the discussion that you're going to see breaking out in the CDU, because otherwise right-wing coalition governments are going to become really, really hard. In the next Swedish election, you are going to see cooperation between the mainstream right and the populist party, not in government, but they're going to coordinate in their electoral campaigns. The populists will support a right-wing government. And that's exactly the discussion you're going to see going on in Germany after the election. But it's a dance. It's a dance between the center right moving a little bit to the right and the right-wing populists deciding to purge their more kooky, less respectable elements.
I do agree. It might be one of the major or crucial points if the AfD moves, as you have pointed out, to a more respectable direction. But exactly the opposite happened. If we are going back in the history of the AfD, they radicalized dramatically in the 2015, then made it to the Bundestag, to the German parliament, with 12.8% of the votes, and they did not moderate. They became even more radical, and the candidates and the top leadership of the party is more to the right now in 2021 than before. If we look from a Scandinavian point of view, as you did from Sweden, but if we go to Norway, if we go to Finland and Denmark, all the best democracies we have on the globe, they have seen some kind of formal or informal coalition. But isn't Germany a country which has such an historical legacy that the cordon sanitaire is still stronger despite the break of a taboo in 2015 or 2017? Bridget, you told us that Ireland is not infected by this right-wing populist virus. What did you do better than most of the other European countries in this regard?
I don't think that we did anything better, but the Irish electoral system, the nature of the electoral system keeps Irish politicians very close to the electorate. So there's intra-party competition, and you cannot be elected in Ireland unless you are very close to where the society is. And so I think you didn't get that disenchantment with the core. Also, because the challenger party came from the left, Sinn Féin, and it will become a party of government over the next cycle, it has managed migration very responsibly. And I think all political parties in Ireland have tried to ensure that migration does not become a contested issue. And despite the fact that historically Ireland was a country of emigration, interestingly, we have 17% of the Irish Those who live in Ireland today were born outside Ireland. So Ireland went from a country of emigration to immigration in a very, very short period of time. And I think it is that the political parties have not tried to mobilize on this issue. Had they, there is an available electorate, I imagine, but they have not mobilized on the issue. Because once that genie comes out of the bottle, as we know, it's very difficult to get that genie back. So I think it's a combination of the electoral system, closeness of politicians to the electorate, but also then the way in which both mainstream parties, but also Sinn Féin, have approached the issue of migration.
Carsten, directly?
Well, yes, but more maybe back again to right-wing populists in general, and maybe the AfD. So one observation is that they will more or less repeat the same result like in the last elections. But as we all now agree, they have moved radically to the right. So these 10% of the electorate are really now voting for a really right-wing extremist party, which wasn't necessarily the case in the last election. So that's worrisome. And on the CDU and CSU, we should also add to this, and they are holding the line. So far, my impression is that they do, and not only vis-a-vis the AfD, but for obvious reason, I followed also their take on other right-wing populists in Hungary. There, I have to say, there was a major shift from Seehofer to Söder, where Söder seems to have a much stricter separation line to Orban, to Fidesz. So this is something, and I don't hear any sort of questionable campaign slogans from the CSU. So while we now worry about what will happen in the future, we should acknowledge that right now they try to their best, it seems to me, the large parts. It's just the problem, what will happen if the results are very bad in the elections.
Let's not stick too long with the AfD. There are more, let's say, positive developments. There is one catch-all party, or one half catch-all party, where we all were writing about the decline, and suddenly now in 10 weeks, they were rising out of the ashes, and some social democrats are already celebrating this success of the SPD. Is this a sustainable increase of votes, or do we see just a personal effect which is working only for a short period of time? Or do we see a somehow anachronistic return to center-left catch-all party? Thomas, this is a research project for your institute, certainly.
Yes, thank you. Well, I would say that we were going through a period of time when the Social Democrats were incredibly undervalued. If you were a stock exchange trader, you would say they were simply undervalued, and 15% is not where the party is. Structurally, when you look at the members, when you look at the distribution of preferences in Germany, and I think both large parties are strong enough also in the medium term to be somewhere between 20 and 30% still in Germany. They're still strong machines. And now we have to add the third party, the Greens. All three parties are with a slight modification, the Greens, but the other two, they are relatively strong organizationally when it comes to their membership still. I mean, they have declined, we all know this, but they're still powerful machines. And when you drive around Germany now, and that's what I meant in my opening statement, then you see that the Social Democrats, they put posters up everywhere. Unlike the Christian Democrats, they are on the ground, they're present on the ground. So I think also in the medium term, these parties are strong enough to be somewhere between 20 and 30%. 15% was definitely too low, and they are normalizing now, I think. And that brings me to the Greens. I think the Greens will, in the medium term, be a contender for third place. They have enormously grown in terms of membership. They have a much younger membership than the other parties. So in the medium term, we will see a competition between these three parties, and there's still the Liberal Party, but they are not as strong and they are more dependent on political seasons, I would say. But the three others, they are not, I mean, we see a normalization of the German party system, but it's not necessary that goes down and down and down. I think they've reached their low point, the Social Democrats. The Christian Democrats may reach their low point soon, and but they are strong enough to recover up to a point. But what we are not going to see is election results close to 40%. This is a thing of the past.
I do agree, but where should the voters for the Greens come? The Greens are a party of the educated young people. And these are inbuilt limits to electoral growth. They will win votes from the younger people, and but normally only from the educated ones. And we were completely astonished when we saw these 27 or 28% of the opinion polls. I never, by the way, easy to say now. But I never believed it, and I think I wrote about it or said something in public that this is a bubble which will burst. And is it something would we, and if it is so the case, why? If it possible that the Greens become a party with 25%, I have serious doubts.
No, if I may just answer that, maybe I wasn't clear enough. I think the Greens will be the third relatively strong party, but structurally, I think they will lag behind the other two. I fully agree with that they were so overrated, but they're good enough structurally for results around 15–20%, and a lot because they are party of the service sector. They're party of the state sector, and not only of the very young, as we know. The Graying of the Greens was a nice book a few years ago. So they have a socioeconomic base, which is basically defined by highly educated people living from state money, if I want to sort of be a bit ironic about it. So people like me, basically. And we also see that, and that's an unlikely case, we must not forget that they have governed Baden-Württemberg, which is an industrial heart, which has an industrial heartland, you know, which is the heart of the car industry. And they had relatively strong results there. So what I mean is you add the structural 15 or so percent and add a strong leader, and then they could go higher. And this is what we're going to see in the future.
Okay, but this would be a major discussion whether the Green Prime Minister of Baden-Württemberg was not somehow governing like a Christian Democrat. But this is, let's push it aside. Let's talk for a moment about the coalitions. This is the topic of these days. From a democratic theoretical point of view, one could say it's highly problematic that German voters do not know for which government they are voting. Is it simply an academic point of view, or is it relevant? They vote for the Greens or the Liberals, and these two parties probably will appear in some kind of coalitional formula. So wouldn't it be then rational for voters vote for the top parties, the strongest parties, then they know for what they are voting? But if they vote for the Greens, if they vote for the Liberals, they may not vote, they may not know for which government they are voting at the end. Sheri?
So this is an important difference between the big parties getting, you know, in the 20s and getting in the 30s or the 40s, right? You now have coalition formation that is much more complicated. It's not between one big party and one small party. It's between three parties at the very least. More parties, more difficult discussions, more complicated policy agendas. So I think it's not so much as problematic from a democratic perspective. I mean, this is what proportional representation systems do in the sense of representation. I would say that it is very problematic from the perspective of voters being able to either A, identify what it is that parties are doing, and B, it becomes much harder for parties to maintain clear profiles simply because in coalitions, the more parties there are, the more compromises need to be made, the more watered down any particular profile gets. I will say that from an outside perspective, the most interesting thing about the election in a week, assuming the polls are relatively accurate, is whether or not you get an SPD Green FDP coalition or an SPD Green left coalition. For reasons that I still don't understand, having studied German politics forever, why the allergy to minority governments is so strong, I don't know. Obviously, the polls were correct. The logical thing would be an SPD Green government supported by the left on a whole variety of economic issues. But for whatever reason, nobody seems to like that in Germany. I don't know why. But a three-party coalition, either one of those is going to have some very significant structural problems. From an economic perspective, you know, the SPD, the Greens, and the left make perfect sense, right? It would be a win-win for everyone on the left, clear economic profile, very clearly left-wing. German voters would understand what left means and what right means. That's important, I think, very important for democracy. The left in Germany, the left party in Germany has held on to some very anachronistic, really, you know, irresponsible foreign policy positions that are going to make that very hard. The right is trying to exploit that. But a coalition with the FDP, like, I don't know, like, how is that going to give voters any clarity on a whole variety of issues? It's going to do to the SPD exactly what the coalition with Merkel did. It's going to force it to make compromises on its core economic issues that are just going to kill it electorally. So from my perspective, again, this coalitional issue, which becomes much more difficult with parties, big parties in the 20% range as opposed to the 30 to 40% range. This is really where a lot of the, you know, where a lot of the future direction of German politics is going to be decided.
I do not, 1 second, Carsten, but I do not think that there will be a chance for left SPD Green coalition. The SPD, by the way, would probably could accept Die Linke as a coalitional partner. Not if it comes to NATO, not if it comes to these kind of questions in foreign policy, but they would not have anyway. As a 6% party, they would be completely removed from this political area. But they will not even get a majority for a governing coalition. But interesting would be, can the Greens join a Jamaica coalition where you have a market-oriented, sometimes neoliberal FDP on the one side and conservatives on the other side, pro-market-oriented as well? Wouldn't it be then a disaster for the Green Party and the sympathizers for the Greens? Carsten, if you want to ask another question, then
no, you exactly the same things. I wanted to also point out that there is a possibility, even with the SPD gaining most votes, that the Greens will be dragged into a coalition with the CDU and FDP. It would be a disaster. I agree with this. And this very interesting idea of a minority government, I hadn't thought about it, but now thinking back to the TV debate yesterday, where there was a clear agreement between Baerbock and Scholz, so that some commentators already said that, okay, they want to do it together now, maybe alone. So maybe this is something in the making, or they know something more. We know only need 2 or 3% more than the polls actually now predict for both parties. And then this would be even mathematically feasible. So an interesting thought.
There was just a question popped up before I ask later, Bridget, what this kind of coalition would mean for the European Union. If we look from the European Union to the coalition building process in Germany, are there any preferences where they find the most pro-European coalition? But before we come back to this outside point of view, I have a question now coming from the audience saying, is there anything the CDU can offer to the Greens what the Social Democrats cannot offer? Who tries? Thomas?
That's a very good question, and I think not much actually. And that's also what we saw in the last TV debates and what we saw during the campaign, that there is more overlap between the Social Democrats and the Greens, and the cooperation of the Christian Democrats is the more unlikely case. I think that's pretty obvious. One has, of course, to always remember that the leaderships may be closer. The electorates may also, some of the electorate, we must not forget that the Greens, they tend to have the highest income earner electorate. So there are limits to how much redistribution they really want at the end of the day. And that is something the Green leadership needs to factor in. And the Green leaders, especially when you listen to Habeck, I think he could live quite well with a bourgeois coalition. So we need to disentangle a bit the levels of the party. But when I look at the party activists, the members, and what they write in their programs, the question is absolutely right. The overlap of Social Democratic program with the Social Democratic program is much larger.
What they normally can offer is power, but now they don't have that much power anymore. But in programmatic terms, they cannot offer very much, and it can be a trap. Jamaica can be a trap for Greens, so to say, living through a period where there is a cleavage running through the party. And I don't think that the mid-level elites would accept it. Bridget, seen from the outside, what would be the most European coalition formula Brussels would like to see in Berlin?
So I think one can take it that there will be a lot of attention in Brussels to the early polls that emerge after the election, when the ballot boxes are closed, because it really is, this election is not an earthquake election, but it is a consequential election for the rest of Europe. I don't think Brussels or even the other capitals would necessarily have preferences, because they know that they must deal with whatever government emerges in whatever combination of parties, and they will deal with them. But if I think, looking at Macron sitting in the Elysee, I think he would probably favor Schulz. He would want to see the Social Democrats taking power. I think he has tried very hard to move the European agenda, particularly on economic governance with the CDU. And I think he now thinks he would have, that they will want a reinstatement of the Growth and Stability Pact versus the Social Democrats. They're talking about a so-called sustainability pact and minimum wages and things like that. So I think Macron, facing into an election year himself, would have a preference for a government in Berlin that was led by the Social Democrats, and it looks like he will probably get that. But of course, it will depend on what the outcome of the election is in terms of seats, as to what the viable combinations are. And the coalition will be the minimal needed for a majority. And from what I understand, that has to be 3 parties. Now, if the Greens and the FDP are in government together, then you do have a tension when it comes to the climate agenda on whether or not you favor market measures or public intervention and public incentives, and what combination. So I do think that the actual coalition negotiations themselves and the outcome will be watched very carefully across Europe. But the capitals and Brussels will be very polite in the process and not want to show any preference one way or the other.
Did I understand you right, that a major factor is that in German politics should be stability? We have seen during the last decades, after Helmut Kohl, no really enthusiastic German chancellor in favor of European integration. But we have seen quite stable governments during this time. And if last sentence, Bridget. If we have a coalition with 3 parties, it might not be that stable anymore, and this might be a problem for the European Union or not.
So that depends on the level and degree of instability. What I think would be very problematic for the EU would be major conflicts within a German government on some of the big agenda items, which are the Green Deal and defense and security. So a lot will depend on what the conflicts are about and how serious they are. But of course, because of Merkel and because she's been this stable presence in the European Council over such a long time, she's been the crisis manager, then Berlin is looked to as that axle of stability within the EU. And that's going to change, because even the fact that there will be a new German chancellor will be, in a way, a major shock for everyone, because it's not Merkel. I mean, the whole of Europe has now got to come to terms with the fact that this chancellor will no longer be in that position in Germany once the election and the coalition negotiations are over. So stability, yes, but I also think it goes beyond stability, and that is that for all of Europe to find the collective capacity, however that is achieved, to deal with the major transformational agendas that are there, and both globally, but also within Europe, in terms of the redevelopment of political economy, what the social contract looks like. We really are in a switching time. And Germany as a major European state, although not big enough to be a hegemon, is really important. It is the indispensable EU member state.
Indispensable. Sheri, do the Democrats, does Biden have a closet preference for any coalition we might see ahead?
I doubt it. I mean, I suppose he might have some, sort of minor preference for a coalition led by the center left, insofar as, the more center left governments there are in power, sort of there's a reputational thing. I mean, I think what he would like from any government is, one that cooperates with the United States on some key issues. I think he'd like a government that, committed to that 2% spending, which, brings up again some of our questions about, sort of coalitions, that maybe took a somewhat harder line against Russia and China than Merkel has. But, the CDU under Laschet would be not, a particularly right-wing government from the American perspective. So I think insofar as both the obvious, the probable chancellor candidates, that from the CDU, CSU, and from the SPD, would be relatively friendly to the United States. The distinction would be, which one would you likely to get more or easier cooperation on. So I haven't heard, a lot of chatter among, in the press or in Democratic circles about a super strong preference. But I think, you always prefer your own quote unquote family member just because it's a little easier and there's some reputational issues, but it's more a question of who's more likely to do what, what the United States prefers.
And if we look from a geopolitical point of view on what is going on in the election and afterwards in Germany, shouldn't the United States not expect that an SPD-led government will not be that easily included on the super Atlantic side if it comes to such an geopolitical game, because Germany has wide business and economic interest in China, and China would immediately probably respond. With a Christian Democrat, the United States might have a more willing partner.
No, this is not my strong suit, but I have to say, with the 16 years of Merkel, we didn't talk a lot about her legacy, but, one thing I think that, at least for outside observers, is sort of, maybe a little bit on the downside was, she has not been very strong on pro-democracy, human rights issues with strong trading partners of Germany. So, she's seen as being soft, not just obviously on Hungary, right? That's the most tragic case because it's a European Union country, but also on Russia and to some degree on China. And so, again, that is a sort of a source of some frustration, I would say, in the United States. So insofar as there was some continuity in the CDU on that, it's not clear to me that it would be, a sort of advantage from an American perspective to have a CDU-led government over an SPD one. But again, that could change. But under Merkel, the Germans are seen as being soft on some of these, again, sort of illiberal, undemocratic countries in the service of defending or promoting German economic interests. To be fair, all countries do that. We do. We are talking about this submarine deal, but other countries do it, but they want the other countries not to do it as much as they do.
Bridget? Bridget?
Sorry, I found it difficult to unmute. Just very briefly, I thought, Ursula von der Leyen gave her State of the Union speech last week. And what was interesting, she is a Merkel protege. Her links to Berlin are extremely strong, but it was very critical of China. In fact, she named China and forced labor several times in her speech. So I think that the consensus broadly across Europe is certainly there is a rebalancing of the European approach to China happening, and Germany will be part of that. And it's something to do with the transatlantic relationship, but not only. For the last couple of years, there's been a lot of discussion about China being a cooperation partner, but also systemic rival. And so I think we're seeing a shift, and Germany will be part of that shift.
Just a brief question on Hungary. If we have Carsten here, is Hungary nervous about the coalition formation in Germany because they are constantly threatened by potential measures against their autocratic politics?
Good question. So I have obviously no insider knowledge there, but a bit my sense is that since the time they were forced out of the EVP, the Conservative Party bloc in the European Parliament, most sort of courtesy manners have anyways been dropped. So while he would sort of restrain himself before a bit more, I think this has anyway lost, sort of is less, and irrespective of who will be in the German government. But of course, I think that an SPD chancellor and an SPD foreign minister or a green foreign minister would put much more pressure. If they get nervous about this is another question. As long as BMW, Mercedes keeps investing in Bosch, so it's cheap talk.
Can I move to the coalition, or can I open another avenue of question to the coalition formation? Which are the potential cracks, Thomas? Cracks which might run through a coalition which we call Ampel or traffic light coalition? Or is this the most stable form we can think about?
I think culturally there's a certain crack. Well, the difficult thing would be the liberals. I think culturally and programmatically, we've said this before, Social Democrats and Greens are relatively, I mean, they're obviously not identical, but they are friends. The liberals would, in many respects, be a lot more in favor of market-oriented solutions. I think on the elite level, they could agree, but when it comes to the party rank and file, to the activists, that is a certain cleavage which will be difficult to bridge. So that's a question of economic philosophy, but then there's also a major problem between the liberals and the Social Democrats when it comes to giving money to the poorer segments of society. I think that's fairly clear. They have a very different approach to the tax regime. They are not necessarily in favor of raising minimum wages, etc. So there are quite a lot of problems. I'm not convinced that depending, I mean, we must not speculate about the election outcome. Everything is possible at the moment, we know this. But I think there is a serious potential to explore the left-wing option, you know, the red-green option. Even though I completely agree that the foreign policy dimension is a difficult one, but on many other issues, I think that is on the cards also.
What is quite amazing, and this might be interesting for the foreigner in our audience as well, that the German constitution does not have a provision who starts the coalition talks. So there is no Bundespräsident who picks up, so to say, the winner of the election and gives him a mandate to open coalition talks. This is quite surprising for Germany. Germany tends to regulate these things by law. It did not. Does it create more flexibility, or is it a deficit of our constitution?
If I may briefly answer, that's surprising. And what we learned in the last round, after the last election, is also that the German constitution does not have any time frame. So they could conceivably go on for very long, and we already see speculations in the press that the next Christmas speech is still going to be delivered by Angela Merkel. It's not very unlikely, actually. But still, I think we have enough informal, but yet sort of fairly institutionalized channels. The federal president has shown in the past that he can also play a role. The parties can talk to each other. I don't think this is a weakness. We've had difficult situations before where surprising coalitions were formed. What can be said is that, or what can be predicted is that it will take quite a long time, because whatever is on the cards is difficult to negotiate. But I don't think we are lacking the institutional mechanisms.
Any more comments on that? Okay, so let's hope that we do not slip into the Belgium disease and have coalition talk for how many, 570 or something days. Then Merkel really will become the champion governing Germany 17 years. This was a kind of bridge to our last round. Angela Merkel, 16 years in government. Is there any legacy, or were these only 16 years and we forget about Merkel quite rapidly after the elections? We know about Willy Brandt, we know about Adenauer. They had long-lasting legacies, and even Gerhard Schröder to some extent with the Agenda 2010. Do we have a legacy of Angela Merkel? And of course, of Helmut Kohl, we had long-lasting legacies as well. Carsten?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. What I find sort of funny almost is that when you ask non-Germans about Merkel, they point out that she's always so serious and not very pretentious. She's calm, and you know, this contrast with many of the politicians in other countries with whom she had to deal. I mean, just go through the list from Berlusconi and so on. But the steady hand that helped, that she had, and that helped, I think, to solve crisis at the international level, at the same time within Germany created some problems, and they will be her legacies. So if you look at the big decisions she has taken, and there were just few of them, so ending atomic energy, the response to the refugee crisis in 2015, or this European Recovery Fund now, these all seem like ad hoc ideas that she didn't want to do, but she responded to an emergency. And none of those initiatives she has really followed up. I mean, the German energy turnaround, Energiewende, got stuck since years. So this will be a big task for the successor. The integration of refugees, I think, is mostly done by volunteers than by federal level policy design. So she didn't follow up on this. And the EU reform plans, Brigitte already pointed this out, and others, they are up in the air with little to no input from Merkel over the past years. So that is probably her legacy, big decisions that haven't been finished.
Is this a typical internal German point of view, which is unable to recognize that she had successful policies as well?
No, I did mention that she, because the way she acted, she saved us from mayhem in maybe several occasions. So I do acknowledge this, and I did acknowledge this. But at the same time, I think that style of government has created problems within Germany.
Is the AfD a legacy of her, or is this a right-wing myth?
To some extent, yes, but it's difficult to blame her, really. I mean, I don't know if it's a right-wing myth to say that if you move to the center, then there's space on the right. It almost seems a physical law, if you will. But could she have not moved to the center? That's another question. So
we always read and heard that Angela Merkel is more respected in foreign countries than at home. And if she is respected, and if we listen to the voices from abroad, which were the points the outside, the external observers really emphasized and argued that this was a great chancellor and this was an important politician? Who dares, Bridget?
So I think she was a crisis chancellor, and she managed at several stages, but particularly in the Eurozone crisis, she both made that crisis more expensive and worse than it could have been, but she also made sure that the euro didn't collapse. And if the euro had collapsed, then it would have been a catastrophe globally and not just in Europe. So I think she almost when it came to crises, she had to be pushed into action, but she always did enough to keep the show on the road. And keeping the show on the road at times of crisis is also an achievement. But I think she also learned, and I think her response to the pandemic, I think she learned from the Eurozone crisis, and her response to the pandemic was much better. In other words, she understood that she needed to support the resilience and recovery fund in a way that she wouldn't 10 years earlier. She wouldn't have even gone there. Now, she says it's only temporary one-off, but temporary can live a long time. And I think once that taboo is broken, it's broken. For me, the downside, and then she also brought to the European Council a measure of expertise. She always knew her brief. She always, apparently the only people who could intellectually take her on at the European Council were two Italian prime ministers, Monti initially and then Draghi. But all of the others, she dominated them in terms of her command of the brief. I've also heard from, for some research I'm doing on Brexit, that she held the line on the single market in a way that maybe other German chancellors would have decided to go the sectoral route and to basically support the car manufacturers. For me, I think the legacy that for the rest of Europe that is damaging is the rule of law in East Central Europe. I think had she been less polite, had Orban and Fidesz been kicked out of the EPP earlier, as they should have been, they were protected by the CDU for far longer than they should have been. And she could have changed that. And that for me is the downside of the legacy.
Very interesting. This is something which we do not discuss in Germany, by the way. Sometimes we hear a bit of it, but there's no serious discussion that the Germans and the German government and the chancellor played an important role in not pushing the Hungarian government more to the democratic side. Sheri, how about the United States of America? Obama seemed to go very well along with Angela Merkel. Let's not talk about Donald Trump, but now the new administration did not pay too much attention to her, or is it a completely wrong perspective?
Well, I mean, I think part of the reason perhaps for the latter is just simply that, you know, she's on her way out. And so while respect is paid to her for having led Germany for so long, obviously you're cultivating, you know, ties for the future, not for the past. But I'd like to return to this point Bridget made, because I think it's a really important one. I mean, you know, look, I think Merkel's claim to fame, such as it is, unlike the other longstanding chancellors that you mentioned, is she's not associated with a particular policy or a particular event, but rather that she remained a voice of kind of calm rationality during a period when calm, rational politics was really quite rare in the West. But, you know, from the perspective of democracy, I think that, you know, some very serious criticisms of her canon should be made. This one about, you know, look, we're going to put Russia and China aside because those are bigger powers outside the European Union. But what's going on, or what has happened in Hungary, is a tragedy. And the fact that the European Union has let that happen, and I say let that happen because I do believe that more can and should have been done, part of that has to be laid at Merkel's feet. She is was the most powerful leader in Europe. German companies dominate to a large degree the Hungarian economy. And the fact that, you know, he was allowed to turn his country into a non-democratic place, that is something, again, she's not solely responsible for, neither is Germany, nor for that matter, the European Union, but blame should be had. And I think a similar critique is often made on the American side about the financial crisis, right? Which is that German banks came first. And that, you know, if you're a big picture person and you care about Europe's future and you care about the future of democracy, that making that balance between national interest and long-term concerns, that she was always walking a tightrope on those things and could never quite jump over to the side that said, okay, look, I'm going to take a hit domestically and, you know, make my banks take a hit, make German industry take a hit, and I'm going to do what, you know, might be risky, but is probably necessary to secure the long-term future of whatever, the European Union, democracy in Europe, yada, yada. And so, I mean, these kinds of critiques are really quite live, at least in the American literature. I'm not saying that that obviates her other successes, but those are real things that at the very least, you know, Merkel has to take some responsibility for, I think.
Very, very interesting. I have a last question, an inside question, and from the audience, I reduce it a bit. And the second part of this question is, how serious is the Linke about leaving NATO? This is something for Thomas or Carsten.
I think, sorry, now I've jumped in. I think they are, the rank and file is serious, many of them. But some of the party elites think they can manage the problem. But I don't think that with a Linke, with the left party in the coalition, some difficult foreign policy decisions will be possible. But we have seen, having said this, we have seen this before also with the Greens, that they were deeply split, deeply divided about some of these decisions. So it all depends on how strong they would be in a possible government.
Carsten?
Yeah, I would say the same, and it seems that they will not be very strong in any government. I mean, they might be even at the risk of not making it to parliament if their decline continues. It seems to me a little bit in the last couple of weeks, they use it more as a token, this NATO thing, as a bargaining chip, and then they sort of give up this, and in exchange, they get something else.
And this is the last point I want to bring up or to respond to this question. We can assure the person who posed this question that the Germans are here in writing a coalition treaty very detailed and specific. It's no longer 5 or 10 pages as it was in the 1950s. It's a thick book, and everything will be regulated, and they will certainly regulate this foreign policy issue if Die Linke makes it to the government. But if I would be forced to bet on this, there will be no left SPD and Green coalition, and the Greens will not accept it. I'm completely sure about it, and I share your point of view, Carsten. The figures will be not, the votes will be not enough for forming a coalition. I do not respond anymore to the question of Sheri. She posed why are the Germans so stubborn or stupid not to accept minority governments. This has a lot to do with the political culture in this country, the competitiveness and rent-seeking of political parties, and there is no Scandinavian culture of tolerating this kind of minority government. I thank you very much for this highly interesting panel. I learned quite a lot from the inside and the outside. And since I have already decided for which party I will vote, the discussion does not influence it, but I learned from it. So thank you very much, Sheri. Have a nice day still in New York. And you already entered the evening now in Ireland with 1 hour delay. And thank you very much, Carsten and Thomas. have a good time, and we will see how the Germans will vote on Sunday. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.